The betrayal of Putin came from one step further. Russian Defense Minister Andrei Belousov has joined forces with senior generals in the army. Having decided to stop the war before dragging Russia into an even bigger disaster militarily, politically, and economically, Belousov defied Russian leader Vladimir Putin by getting the full support of the army behind him. Thousands of Russian soldiers who left the war on the instructions of the Minister of Defense are leaving the territory of Ukraine. The military activity on the Russian borderline brings with it the footsteps of the coup attempt. The developments in the recent period of the Russia-Ukraine war, which has been going on for more than 2 years, have rapidly increased tensions globally. Russian President Vladimir Putin, who has been making threatening statements targeting the Central European and Baltic countries even before the end of the current war, has once again proved that he sees this invasion attempt as just the beginning. The expansionist and aggressive policies of the Russian leader, who increases the likelihood of a global catastrophe such as a new world war with every step he takes, have led to the complete loss of tolerance of the Western Bloc countries led by the United States. The Russian economy, which has been dragged to the brink of a major wreck by the interventions of Western countries that have further expanded the scope of the embargoes they have imposed on Russia, has faced the fastest inflation increase in its history. At this point, millions of Russian citizens who decided to leave Russia permanently in order to get away from both the impact of the war and economic and political instability led to the beginning of a major labor shortage in the country. Despite this bad situation in Russia, where there are problems that will take years to solve in every respect, and despite the casualties of the Russian armed forces, Russian leader Vladimir Putin, who has not given up his insistence on the continuity of the war, is signing more irrational decisions every day than before. The last of these decisions ignited a major civil war within the Kremlin. As is known, many mobilization decisions came into force in Russia throughout the war. These mobilization decisions, taken in order to keep the manpower in the army at a constant level, led to the forced recruitment of almost 1 million Russian citizens into the army. Vladimir Putin, who wants to avoid the public reaction to this application and the criticism that will be directed as much as possible, has put the Russian Defense Ministry in charge of the announcement and implementation of the mobilization grounds. This repressive practice, which led to the dismissal of former Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, was not brought up for a long time during the ministerial term of Andrei Belousov, who was appointed to replace Shoigu, until the last war cabinet meeting held at the Kremlin Palace. After the cross-border offensive of the Ukrainian armed forces, in which Russia captured more than 1,000 square kilometers of territory in the Kursk Oblast, Putin suggested that there was not enough manpower to defend this region and assigned Russian Defense Minister Belousov to urgently enact a new mobilization decision. This decision of Putin, who demanded that at least 200,000 male Russian citizens be recruited into the army by the end of autumn, led to a great tension in the meeting hall. The government, which has already become the focus of heavy public criticism for its inability to ensure border security, could face widespread riots if it announces a new mobilization decision, officials said, warning Putin to take a step back. But Putin, who insists on implementing the mobilization decision by continuing to fall under the delusion of power, has paid the price of his ambition very heavily. Andrei Belousov, who could no longer tolerate Putin's outdated war strategy, who thought that too much manpower would allow them to continue the war as long as they wanted, made a critical move that would bring a radical end to this war by doing what Shoigu could not. Belousov, who was found to have contacted many senior generals in the Russian armed forces at the initial stage, immediately arranged a phone call with the commanders of some headquarters on the active battlefield. Andrei Belousov, who was closely monitored after these suspicious conversations that attracted the attention of employees of the Russian Intelligence Service Directorate, made no announcements and project preparations for the mobilization decision, despite the passage of days. It became clear days later how much confusion this internal political crisis, which has seriously increased tensions, could lead to. The soldiers stationed at the Russian headquarters, who received a joint declaration signed by 12 Russian generals, left their headquarters hours later and began to withdraw quickly from the front line. The Ukrainian forces, who have made a critical progress in the simultaneous retaliatory operations they launched in the year 2024, were completely surprised by this unexpected activity in the Russian positions they are currently following. The declaration that ignited the fuse of this sudden withdrawal, which continued during the night hours, also fell into the hands of the Kremlin in the morning. The Russian generals who signed the declaration contained in the report prepared by the head of the Russian intelligence service, Sergei Narishkin, ordered the soldiers to withdraw, noting the internal and external political, economic, and social problems that continuing the invasion attempt would create for Russia. Thousands of Russian troops had already reached the Russian borderline when the Kremlin administration, which was extremely late in being informed of the situation, tried to intervene. Russian soldiers, who made a great effort to return to their country after their arguments with the border guards turned into a brawl, may ignite the fuse of a very large-scale coup attempt if they enter Russia after this point. Anticipating this danger, the Kremlin administration has begun to take security measures in front of military centers in the capital Moscow and St. Petersburg regions. If the soldiers in these two regions abandon their posts and support the coup attempt, it is extremely possible that Putin's throne will be overthrown in less than 24 hours. The really critical point is that the name behind this possible coup attempt is Russian Defense Minister Andrei Belousov. According to the report presented by the head of the Russian intelligence service Narishkin, Belousov revealed that he had recently contacted each of the 12 Russian generals mentioned in the declaration, but he also held talks with the headquarters where the Russian soldiers who agreed to withdraw were assigned just one day before the events. The sudden disappearance of Russian Defense Minister Belousov, who refused to share the same fate as Shoigu, and at the same time aimed to prevent Russia from being dragged into an irreversible wreck, has further raised suspicions. The comments of political experts on this issue, who predict that many Kremlin officials will provide more support to this internal revolution initiated by Belousov in the near future, have caused a huge echo on the agenda of the whole world. Reminding once again that there are many examples in the history of world politics where dictatorial regimes were destroyed by their own armies in the face of a coup attempt during the wars they started under the delusion of power. Political experts claimed that Russian President Vladimir Putin is step-by-step closer to sharing a similar fate. Having deprived his people of even the most basic democratic rights, imposed very heavy sanctions on the Russian armed forces, and turned the Russian parliament into a completely dysfunctional entity in order to secure his throne and expand the jurisdiction of the empire of power during his 24-year rule, the Russian leader has put his personal interests above the survival of the country. Especially the decisions he made during the Ukrainian war and the steps taken by Putin, who clearly showed that he had completely lost control, completely shook the influence and authority that the Russian dictator had been trying to achieve for years. It is extremely possible that Putin, who no longer receives full support even within the Kremlin, will be dethroned by the closest figures if the war continues. Putin, who has paid the price very heavily for both his expansionist and aggressive policies and his repressive management approach after more than 2 years of the war, he started promising that it would be won in a few months, is now literally cornered. Referring to the reasons why the army ignited the fuse of a possible coup attempt, experts once again reminded Putin of the promises he made on the first day of the war. The Russian armed forces, which have lost close to 600,000 soldiers and suffered billions of dollars worth of inventory casualties over the past almost 3 years in a war that is promised to be won in just a few months without casualties, are experiencing the worst period in their history. The top generals, who can no longer tolerate the Russian armed forces losing strength and motivation for the personal interests of a few radical-minded officials who can no longer even provide border security, have begun preparing for a coup attempt that will overthrow Putin's throne, which he has been trying to protect for 24 years, in less than 24 hours. Considering that these coup attempt plans have also been supported by the Kremlin, it can be said clearly that no one has any patience with Putin's anachronistic dictatorship anymore. The Russian Air Force has taken the critical step against Putin. However, things are completely mixed up in every area. With that step, Putin's policies have completely changed. A new deconfliction between the Russian Air Force and Putin has manifested itself. This has led to the emergence of a much bigger crisis regionally. When the Russian Air Force, which is also called anti-Putin, rebelled, Putin took that critical step regarding the S-400S. In the recent times of the Ukrainian war, the Russian army began to face very big problems. This would have caused the process to move towards a completely different point from a regional point of view. When a large number of members of the Russian military, who are called anti-Putin, made some statements based on this event, the tension rose more than ever, and everything got mixed up together. The main reason for the losses against the Ukrainian army was that Putin could not fully use his forces in the Russian army. This has caused many problems related to the process to become clearer. If this continues in this way, the advantages to be gained against the Russian army are expected to increase, while Putin is now expected to face bigger problems in all areas. While this caused some changes in Putin's policies, it also paved the way for the Russian Air Force to take a slightly tougher stance at the last meeting. This was the kind of thing that would cause a bigger crisis to occur in every field. It was known that the Russian Air Force was actively used at the very beginning of the war. But besides, Putin's almost deliberate risking of the Russian Air Force for very risky operations, especially after the Patriot missiles were sent to Ukraine by the United States, had changed things. And realizing that he no longer needed the Russian Air Force very much, Putin went through some changes in his moves about them again and began to dismiss the generals, the majority of whom were opponents. This has caused a new regional crisis to be triggered. These generals, who were called anti-Putin, now saw Putin as the main trigger for a bigger crisis in every field. And with that, everything got completely mixed up. Seeing this attitude of the Russian Air Force, Putin acted with a very tough stance against any kind of organized events. This would lead to further growth of problems regionally and to an increase in the advantages directly obtained by the Ukrainian army. Such a large number of names, which are also described as anti-Putin, could have a serious consequence of being provoked so much. But Putin took issue with the commemoration of Kanamat Botashev, who has been called one of the most important generals of the Russian army. The significance of this name is that he was retired early by Putin because he was a dissident, re-enlisted in the army during the war, and sent on a risky mission alone. As a result, it was even among the claims that this general was sent to his death by Putin at that time. Besides, the fact that many achievements that will be achieved have shifted towards similar points has completely changed things. And even though Putin's mistakes have come back to back, and there are still no signs of a change in his attitude, a bigger crisis has emerged in all areas. The statements of the admirals, who are opposed to Putin, who have a very harsh attitude towards this latest event of the Russian Air Force, have caused great repercussions throughout Russia. The generals, who think that such a step to be taken in order to win the war should be in favor of the Russian Air Force, rained criticism on Putin's policies. In addition, the generals, who also stated that the advantages from a regional point of view have now been completely lost, explained that Putin is only gathering more reactions from the Russian military with these moves, and that would completely confuse things regionally. And Putin made that critical decision after this incident, and in an instant, everything changed. Putin, who continued to make such moves despite the losses the Russian army had achieved against Ukraine, became the main trigger of a much bigger crisis. Putin has put forward a new law that completely bans the Russian Air Force's access to MiG-31 fighter jets. However, the Russian Air Force would not have access to fighter jets unless it received orders or permission from the bureaucracy. This decision, which was made due to the increasing tension, caused the tension to rise even more. A large number of soldiers who wanted to do an exercise flight were shocked when they heard about this decision, and then they went crazy with nerves. Along with this incident, a large number of Russian Air Force members gained access to fighter jets, as well as conducted an exercise flight with the aircraft they had. This meant a much bigger crisis for Putin. Anyway, everything changed when Putin became paranoid because of Wagner's coup attempt. As a result of these dynamic problems in the Russian army becoming clearer, things would now completely change. And Putin, afraid of this rebellion of the Russian Air Force, took that critical step. Everything has come to a worse point. After this move by the Russian Air Force, Putin decided to bring the most important air defense systems to Moscow, which are tasked with protecting the Ukrainian region. Although he stated that he had brought it back despite a possible attack on Moscow, he was afraid of a possible coup attempt to be carried out by means of MiG-31S. This event was seen as the beginning of a major uprising within the army. Putin clearly distrusted the military tasked with protecting Russia. This was also seen as the most important point of many chronic problems, and for the first time, politics, which is also pursued as anti-Putin, was also faced with such a big mess. However, while some bigger problems were triggered in all areas now, the likelihood of much more important problems would also increase. It didn't take long for the Ukrainian military to notice this S-400 incident. The Ukrainian army, which has been mobilizing to make numerous moves in the region with the help of unmanned aerial vehicles in its possession, has made moves towards the Russian headquarters. Everything changed when the Ukrainian army, which was aware of a large number of dynamics in the Russian army, realized that the unmanned aerial vehicles could not be shot down completely. The Russian army was using automatic air defense systems in terms of their basic dynamics. But despite this, it was also surprising for them that they could not damage any kind of unmanned aerial vehicles at the rate they wanted. And the Ukrainian army noticed this directly. The group, which also knows that the Russian army is not protected by S-400S, suddenly revealed its most important weapon. Everything has completely changed. The Ukrainian army has recently revealed a large number of Storm Shadow missiles that it obtained under the latest agreements with the UK at this point. The fact that all the advantages that will be obtained from a regional point of view have progressed in such a way as to be based on this has also caused some bigger problems to be triggered. Knowing the location of ammunition depots belonging to the Russian army, the Ukrainian army began firing at a large number of points in a row using Storm Shadows in its possession. This allowed the emergence of a much larger problem-solving mechanism from a regional point of view. Another important factor that changed things was that these great advantages obtained against the Russian army would eventually bring more important points into play. And this incident caused the Russian army to show a very serious reaction. A large number of soldiers, also called anti-Putin, have also almost openly spewed hatred at the Russian bureaucracy. But after that, Putin's steps would change everything. Putin had clearly realized how much trouble he was facing against the Russian army after this incident. Although he did not make an explanation about what happened due to his recent policies, he completely ignored this decision, and he had to increase the concessions made against the Russian army by necessity. In fact, it would be recorded as another important point that would cause a complete change in many dynamics in this region. And with the effect of this, the comments made by the war analysts would also cause some more important problems to arise. According to war analysts, the Ukrainian army had a basic dynamic that could take a much bigger step thanks to these advantages it gained over the Russian army. If it went like this, it was thought that the war would be lost in a short time. The fact that the Russian army has delivered many advantages that will be obtained directly to Ukraine has paved the way for the revelation of a much bigger problem at this point. And despite the possibility that a new process against the Russian army will also begin, it is not known exactly what Putin will do. This incident on the territory of Ukraine led to the whole world happening. The real face of Russian President Vladimir Putin has been revealed. This decision of Putin, who left wounded Russian soldiers fighting on Ukrainian territory to die, has caused a great confusion within the army. Russian soldiers who were injured after an air operation organized by the Ukrainian army wanted to return to the borders of Russia for treatment, but the Russian General Staff did not allow the wounded Russian soldiers to return. Exactly 1,200 Russian soldiers were left for dead at the Russian army headquarters in Bakhmut. The Russian government is arranging neither a doctor nor any medicine shipment to Bakhmut. The confessions of the Russian soldiers trapped in Bakhmut shocked everyone. Interesting developments continue to take place in the war between Russia and Ukraine, which is continuing to rage. The fact that the Russian government has sent hundreds of thousands of troops to the territory of Ukraine, but even the basic needs of these soldiers are not being met, has recently become a frequent topic on the agenda. After the mobilization decision taken by Vladimir Putin on his own, More than 300,000 Russian citizens were forcibly recruited into the army and sent to the territory of Ukraine. The average survival time of these soldiers sent to the front after receiving only 3 weeks of military training is 5 months. These soldiers, who do not know what to do in the face of the ground and air operations organized by the Ukrainian army, do not live very long. Military experts and war analysts had warned Vladimir Putin about this many times. It was stated that the training period of Russian soldiers recruited to the army by the mobilization decision should be increased, and that a 3-week training period was insufficient to train Russian soldiers. Military experts who stated that if these soldiers included in the army are sent to Ukraine, these soldiers will do more harm than good to the army, said that the weapons and ammunition sent to these soldiers will harm them. Now we are seeing that these warnings of military experts are beginning to be realized. In recent weeks, 400 Russian soldiers stationed in the Luhansk border region have decided to lay down their weapons due to a lack of weapons and ammunition. Russian soldiers, who stated that the Russian armed forces have not organized any military shipments to the headquarters where they have been for 9 weeks, say that they are having problems with ammunition. In other words, the Russian government has openly begun not to meet the needs of Russian soldiers included in the army as part of the mobilization decision. Now we are faced with an event called "Not So Much Can Happen." Last March, Russian soldiers sent to the city of Bakhmut by the order of the chief of the Russian General Staff, Valery Gerasimov, were left for dead by Vladimir Putin. The Ukrainian army carried out a large-scale air operation late last night inside the borders of Bakhmut. The Ukrainian army has dealt a big blow to the occupation forces with this operation, which it has organized for the Russian army headquarters in Bakhmut with 2 different strategies. After the Ukrainian intelligence service identified the location of the Russian army headquarters located within the borders of Bakhmut, the commander of the Ukrainian troops stationed in the border area was contacted. The Ukrainian commander asked the Russian army headquarters to organize an air operation with both missiles and unmanned combat aircraft. The attack, which was to be carried out with an unmanned combat aircraft, was to be launched from the city of Lyman. Ukrainian unmanned combat aircraft, which took action from the military base located in Lyman, entered Bakhmut airspace without any problems. Simultaneously, the Ukrainian army stationed in the Bakhmut border region fired 6 missiles at the Russian army headquarters with HIMARS missile systems. That's when the really interesting thing started. After this air operation, which was simultaneously organized by the Ukrainian army, there is nothing left of the Russian headquarters, where it is estimated that about 1,200 Russian soldiers were deployed. Due to the successive explosions inside the headquarters, the Russian soldiers stationed at the headquarters were surprised by what they decamped to. Based on information obtained from regional sources and images obtained from Ukrainian unmanned combat aircraft, it seemed that hundreds of Russian soldiers had lost their lives and were seriously injured. The Russian soldiers, who were seriously injured, reported this air operation organized by the Ukrainian army to their top commanders. Russian troop commanders, who contacted the commanders of the Russian armed forces, reported that they themselves were attacked and that they needed to be evacuated urgently. Ukrainian intelligence waited for hours for a support team that the Russian government would send to the region. Ukrainian intelligence was confident that support troops would be sent to the region for the treatment and evacuation of wounded Russian soldiers at the headquarters. Despite the fact that thousands more Russian troops are being deployed in the Bakhmut city center, no one has come to the area despite the hours-long wait. No reinforcements arrived at the Russian headquarters, where the Ukrainian army had organized an air operation for exactly 8 hours. Neither a doctor was sent to this headquarters, nor a support unit for the evacuation of wounded Russian soldiers. The Russian soldiers stationed here were abandoned to their fate. Despite the fact that there are hundreds of wounded Russian soldiers inside the headquarters, the fact that the Russian government did not arrange for the transfer of troops to this headquarters in any way, and these soldiers were not rescued, managed to shock everyone. In these video images obtained by the Ukrainian intelligence service, it was observed that Vladimir Putin does not even value his own soldiers in any way. So everyone understood that Putin's only wish was to have more Russian troops to fight on Ukrainian soil. This war on the territory of Ukraine, which began on February 24, 2022, is an invasion launched by Vladimir Putin for his own interests. Vladimir Putin thought that the Russian army could complete this invasion of Ukrainian territory alone. Russian leader Putin made some promises to his Russian compatriots when he launched this invasion on the territory of Ukraine, or rather, he had to make these promises. Because in many parts of Russia, Russian citizens who are anti-war and anti-Putin have taken to the streets and started organizing protests. Russian citizens who do not want Russian soldiers to lose their lives on Ukrainian soil for the sake of Vladimir Putin's interests, organized anti-war actions by taking to the streets to prevent this. But Putin, who acts as a dictator who has seized all branches of the state, managed to block these protests of the Russian people quite easily. By deploying the Russian security forces, Putin managed to suppress all these protests on the streets quite easily. However, these protests reappeared every time. Russian citizens again organized marches on the streets to show their reaction. For this reason, Vladimir Putin promised that they will complete this invasion of Ukrainian territory within 5 months, and that no Russian soldiers will be harmed during this invasion. In other words, no Russian soldiers fighting on Ukrainian territory would be harmed. But just 24 hours after Vladimir Putin made these sentences, the Russian army lost 300 soldiers on Ukrainian territory. Later in the war, the military support sent by the United States and Western countries to Ukraine began to reach Ukrainian territory. Important weapons and equipment such as long-range missiles, air defense systems, unmanned combat aircraft, tanks sent to the Ukrainian army have made the Ukrainian army inventory much stronger. The Ukrainian army, which could not show resistance against the occupation forces in the first months of the war, was created almost from the beginning with these weapons and military equipment they had. Thus, it was seen that the war began to turn in favor of Ukraine. It was at this point that Vladimir Putin realized that he could not win this war on Ukrainian soil alone. In fact, Putin, who had previously made a deal with the Wagner leader of the time, Yevgeny Prigozhin, arranged for tens of thousands of Wagner mercenaries to be sent to the territory of Ukraine. All these mercenaries fought in the ranks of Russia. Putin, who also met with Chechen President Ramzan Kadyrov, also known as Vladimir Putin's puppet, also made the Chechen army his ally. Thus, tens of thousands of Chechen soldiers began fighting in the ranks of Russia on the territory of Ukraine. Despite all these allies, the Russian army has not been able to make the progress it wanted on Ukrainian territory. The Russian army cannot continue its advance in the occupied territories, and all they did was to ensure the border security of the occupied territories. In other words, the Ukrainian army had started to be the attacking side, not the defending one anymore. It was from this point that the critical decision came. Rumors began to be heard that partial mobilization would be announced in Russia. Just 18 hours later, it was announced that partial mobilization had been announced in Russia by Vladimir Putin's decision, and that 300,000 Russian citizens would be included in the army. Hundreds of thousands of Russian citizens who did not want to fight for Vladimir Putin on Ukrainian soil left their country, while Russian citizens who had no financial means stayed in Russia and were forced to fight on Ukrainian soil. And still these soldiers continued to be made to fight.